The Nvidia GeForce RTX 4080 is a very powerful and ultra high-end graphics card released back in November of 2022. This card was and remains rather expensive, and as such hasn't really been discussed super heavily in the communities that I've checked. For what it's worth, at this point in time, coming up on 4 years post-launch, it can still run almost any and everything at 4K at or above 60 FPS. But what I find interesting is what Nvidia changed under the hood, because this card represents another major shift in performance per watt and raw performance targets. Let's dig into the RTX 4080, an incredible 16GB graphics card that raises the bar over the prior generation's incredible 3080. Before we dig into this card, I'd like to say not to forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. This content piece was also made possible by MJ, so make sure to leave a comment thanking him. Alongside that, I wanted to mention that this is an Alienware flavor, which means that yeah, it was probably ripped from a pre-existing system at some point, but it performs perfectly fine. In fact, the heatsink on this card keeps it rather cool, calm, and collected in 99% of situations. This card also makes use of the new Nvidia Firewire connector, which, while I'm not a huge fan of a pin configuration this small carrying 600 watts, I've never had any melting or overheating issues. I did take extra time to ensure everything was seated properly, but at the same time this card isn't drawing anywhere near 600 watts, so I don't think it ever comes close to pushing the limits. With that out of the way, let's dig into the specifications of the 4080, and see what sets it apart from other prior generation cards. Nvidia's Ada architecture, when compared to the last 3 generations of cards, is an enormous step up in performance per watt thanks to the new 4N lithographic node, enormous L2 caches, and smaller memory interfaces. The silicon die in this card is much more modestly sized than you'd think based on its raw performance. Featuring the AD103-300A1 graphics processing unit, this die is cut down by 512 FP32 data paths, giving us 9,728 active. But all in all, it comes in at just under 379mm squared, which is a little smaller than last gen's GA104, significantly smaller than Turing's TU104, and still a bit larger than Pascal's GP104. With the full die coming in at just shy of 46 billion transistors, you're getting nearly double the amount found in the 3090. Admittedly though, a lot of these transistors are going into SRAM and the caches, but the fact that this many transistors fit into a die that's this size is incredible to think about, and really shows how far manufacturing techniques have come in the past 10 years. Starting off at a macro level, the Ada streaming multiprocessor found inside the 40 series actually shares a lot of core DNA with prior gen's Ampere SM, in terms of the distribution of the different logic units and what they're capable of processing. The raw distribution of the hardware is also pretty similar. Each warp, which is a substructure in the SM capable of SIMT operations, has the ability to process either a full set of 32 single precision floats, or 16 floats and 16 integers concurrently. With each SM containing 4 warps, this gives us the 128 FP32 CUDA cores that you'd see on a spec sheet describing said SM. The warp also has a special function unit attached to it, which is responsible for things like sine, cosine, and square root, a texture mapping unit, and a 4th generation tensor core. It also has access to a 64KB register file, giving each SM 256KB of total register file capacity. The cache configuration within the SM also hasn't changed much from Ampere, with each possessing a 128KB block of L1 data cache, along with the 64KB L1 texture cache. The data cache is primarily accessed by the warps, while the texture cache is primarily used to accelerate the texture mapping units. The tensor cores function similarly to how Ampere worked, that being having both dense and sparse capabilities, along with physically doubling the number of data paths. This means that the tensor cores are over double the size of the 2nd gen tensor cores found in Turing, but they offer double the throughput in dense ops and far more throughput when performing sparse ops. The 4th gen cores in Ada are capable of performing legacy 4 and 8-bit integers, half floats, double floats, and TensorFloat 32 operations. However, this generation introduces FP8, which is another useful primitive data type for compressing AI algorithms into smaller memory footprints. For graphics work, the only thing these cores are currently useful for is running DLSS or DLAA, simply because the data types they support are not capable of meeting the precision requirements for high-resolution 3D graphics. Along with the tensor cores, Ada comes with a 3rd gen implementation of the ray tracing cores, which come with some interesting new capabilities that will probably become much more important in the coming years. The RT cores, since their introduction in Turing, have been capable of performing bounding volume hierarchy traversals and ray triangle intersection calculations. Ada boasts 2 times the BVH and triangle intersection capabilities found in Ampere on an individual core level. The RT cores in Ada are now able to perform opacity testing on intersections, useful for foliage, smoke, fire, or really anything involving transparent or clear texture work. It also has something called a displaced micromesh engine, which takes a base, lower resolution and/or simpler 3D model, and computes intersections against triangle patches or micromeshes that are defined by a displacement texture. It allows for some stunning results in triangle counts, allowing literally for more depth in your models than tessellation or normal mapping are able to achieve. What this really saves on, according to Nvidia, is the raw number of triangle intersections required, and the resulting BVH complexity. If you can use a very low poly model, and instead just find where you intersect on the particular triangle in your model, then focus on that subsection of the model and perform a fancy algorithm based on a texture sampling operation, instead of raw triangle intersections, you'll save literally hundreds or thousands of cycles. Another feature found in the updated SM is shader execution reordering, or to the more technically inclined, they're now capable of software-defined out-of-order execution. This matters for ray tracing because once rays bounce, the data divergence becomes extremely high. The easiest example of this is a sphere. A certain percentage of the rays will bounce back towards the camera, while others will end up bouncing far away from it. At a very high level, shader execution reordering lets the cores focus on similar rays or chunks of data, allowing it to potentially reuse cached information. This doesn't make things faster by direct metrics, but indirectly this prevents data from being pulled into a cache, then flushed, and then being loaded back in 20,000 pixels. This combined with the large L2 cache on chip means that the workloads execute more efficiently, saving time in your render budget at a macro scale. Additional features included in Ada, such as the 8th generation NVENC video block with AV1 support, are really focused on multimedia use. Like I said a second ago, this time we get full AV1 support, meaning you can decode and encode this incredibly efficient video codec. I do still think that Intel's AV1 encoder in the ARC cards generally does a better job though. AV1 is still awesome to have, and I'm really glad we gained the ability to hardware accelerate it on this generation of cards. The memory available on this card was top of the line when it launched, and even today it's very hard to complain about, even though we lost some interfaces compared to the 3080. Coming in with 8G DDR6X interfaces clocked at 22.4 gigabit per second, this equates to a 256-bit memory bus delivering just shy of 717 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. The capacity of the memory chips available on this card, coming in with 8 16 gigabit or 2 gigabyte modules, leaves us with 16 gigabytes of very fast memory to work with. Whether it's traditional rasterization, ray tracing, or the fancier path tracing, this card has the memory capacity to support full resolution textures and the additional structs in memory required to trace rays throughout an environment, along with the speed to stream enormous chunks of data back and forth. The 64 megabytes of L2 also helps keep down congestion on the memory interfaces, meaning the card can theoretically do more with its existing bandwidth. In terms of clock speeds, the 4080 comes in with a base and boost clock of 2205 and 2505 MHz respectively. In operation, I found 2770 MHz to pop up quite frequently, though the card will sometimes spike up to just shy of 2900 MHz. It never hit or went past that frequency wall, but this does mean that these chips are a gigahertz faster than the Ampere cards. No matter how you want to slice it, Ada is leagues ahead of Ampere in terms of the clock speeds on these chips. At the full operating clocks, the 4080 I've got here is able to push just under 54 teraflops of FP32 and FP16, and nearly 27 TOPS of Int32 compute across the shader cores. To support rendering operations, the 112 rasterization operation pipelines and 304 texture mapping units deliver 310 gigapixels per second and 842 gigatexels per second of drawing power respectively. This is easily the fastest card I've tested in all respects, and this just highlights how monstrous it is in terms of transforming geometry, then drawing and shading it on your screen. Moving into the power draw discussion, and the 4080 has a TDP of 320 watts. During normal operation, the card typically hangs out between 170 and 250 watts, which is actually pretty similar to what old Pascal-based Titans and 1080 Ti's drew. During stress tests, like during extended 3D and video render sessions, the The card is able to draw 320 watts, almost 350 in some cases, but even then it's able to stay well under 80C thanks to the enormous heatsink that the card makes use of. It's significantly improved over last gen's 3080, which consistently drew over 300 watts while gaming, but there are still times where it can pig out and make your power supply cry. All in all, the specs of the 4080 are monstrous, even for 2026 standards, but despite all the changes made, how does it perform in games? To test the 4080, I threw it into my main system, sporting a 14700K paired with a DDR4 Z690 motherboard. This chip is absolutely top of the line still, even though we're coming up on 3 years since it launched. And even though we're pairing it with slower and older 3600 megatransfer per second DDR4, the capacity of 64GB should help to keep the CPU fed with data without spending $1,000 on RAM. I suspect we'll hit CPU bottlenecks pretty consistently at 1080p, but once we jump up to 1440p and 4K, things should move into GPU bottleneck territory, but it will obviously depend on the title. For storage, we're using an SN770 1TB and a Timetech Gen 4 Premium NVMe drive to try and help improve load times and stutters. A full spec list is in the description should you wish to recreate anything you see in this video. With the test system specs roughly out of the way, let's dive into the 4080 and see how well it performs in games. Starting off with a new benchmark title for this channel, Arc Raiders, an Unreal Engine 5.3 game, performed beyond my expectations considering this game can be kind of heavy at times. Tested at the epic settings with dynamic RTX global illumination set to high and using TAA, the game at 1080p was beyond high refresh rate capable, coming in with an average and 1% low of 175 and 96 FPS. 1440p came in with depressed performance in general, but the average lost a higher percentage of frames than the 1% low. With an average of 145 and a 1% low of 83, it's not anywhere near where I'd complain, but the skew is still present in the numbers. Jumping up to 4K and the average and 1% low came in at 84 and 51, the largest percentage drop in performance. However, it also is drawing a much larger quantity of pixels. I'm loving getting into Arc Raiders on the 4080, and even though I'm not really that great at it and usually end up on fire, this card is there for me even in the worst rendering situations. Battlefield 6, built on DICE's Frostbite engine, saw overall performance degradation compared to Arc Raiders, but features more destructive environments. At the Overkill preset and also with TAA enabled, 1080p saw the best performance with the highest recorded frame rate. With the average and 1% low coming in at 148 and 75 FPS, this card once again proves itself to be high refresh rate capable, and it maintains this jumping up to 1440p. Coming in with a 119 FPS average and a 1% low of 70, the 4080 makes relatively light work of this game at this resolution, even jumping up to the full fat 4K, and performance on average remains perfectly playable, coming in at 80, but the 1% low of 8 indicates some stuttering. Thankfully, this is something that DLSS can help to alleviate. Once again, like Arc Raiders, I'm loving playing any and all Battlefield games on this card, but I will admit I consistently make use of DLSS on quality at 1440p and above when it's available. Up next is Black Ops 7, a relatively unpopular but still entertaining entry in the Call of Duty series. Built on the DirectX 12 sporting IW 9.0 engine, the absolute core of this software actually dates back to Quake 3 Arena, with tons of enhancements built on top. The game actually performed pretty similarly on average to Battlefield 6 at 1080p, but turning up the resolution in this title impacted performance much more heavily. Tested at the Extreme preset with depth of field and ray tracing turned off, as well as making use of DLAA, the game looked incredible and still ran very well. At 1080p, the 4080 returned an average and 1% low of 144 and 108, with 1440p dropping things down to 101 and 79 FPS respectively. 4K hit 60 on average, with the 1% low coming in at 28, but in all it didn't really feel that great to play. Like I mentioned in the last title, I'd probably make use of DLSS at 4K, or even turn down settings, but the performance on display as is when taking the quality of the pixels into account is definitely not too shabby. Cyberbug 2077, another DirectX 12 based title, but this time using CD Projekt Red's in-house Red engine, performed poorly at 4K, but that's kind of to be expected from this title. I tested at the Ultra preset with depth of field and ray tracing turned off, and made use of DLAA set to the Transformer mode. Starting off at 1080p, and the average and 1% low of 94 and 62 is definitely beyond playable, but also surprisingly low for a card that's this expensive. 1440p didn't help, with the performance figures returned coming in at 70 and 55 FPS, and 4K was, by my current metrics, unplayable, coming in at 31 and 25 FPS respectively. The maximum for the 4K test also shows how erratic the frame rate could be at times, but by and large it hung out at around the 30 FPS mark. For this particular game, I definitely turned down some settings, and I also think that this is just one of those titles that requires DLSS or some form of upscaling. Almost all modern cards still run this game poorly without something lowering the internal resolution. And while it's fully integrated into Cyberpunk, I'd truly just turn it on and game frames back. Up next is another Unreal Engine 5 based game, also written using a DirectX 12 backend. Fortnite in this first run was tested at the epic settings with Nanite and the RT using Lumen turned off, once again with TAA turned on. All resolutions return truly impressive frame rates, especially 1080p. Coming in with an average and 1% low of 207 and 114 FPS, this is beyond high refresh rate capable and shows just how much horsepower this card has. 1440p came in at 159 and 69 FPS, showing that there was some stuttering, but the 4080 skills to pay the bills kept things in check. And finally, 4K returned an average of 97 and a 1% low of 57, remaining beyond playable at all times. The second test I performed was also at the epic settings, but this time with Nanite turned on and both Lumen settings set to high. It cut performance almost cleanly in half on average, which was surprising considering how much these updated algorithms improved the final image quality. I think that using RT in Fortnite is definitely possible, especially at lower resolutions. And the solution for 4K is, once again, to just use DLSS or even turn down some settings. Fortnite in all just ran better than I was expecting, and the fact that you can remain competitively viable using ray tracing was what surprised me the most. GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, built on an upgraded DirectX 12 Fork of Rage, performed well but ran into pretty obvious CPU bottlenecking at 1080p. I ended up testing at the very high RT preset with depth of field turned off, and the game looked absolutely incredible and ran like a dream as well. At 1080p, it returned an average and 1% low of 145 and 62 FPS. When comparing to 1440p, things looked almost identical, probably because there was a CPU bottleneck. I did notice two of the P cores in my 14700K were hitting 95% usage, while the GPU was only hitting about 70% usage. Once I jumped up to 1440p, the GPU usage was sitting near 100%, but my CPU was also displaying the same behavior. 4K was the first figure that I'm 100% confident was not impacted by CPU usage issues, with the average and 1% low coming in at 105 and 84 FPS. No matter what resolution you choose to play at, it seems like around 150 FPS is where this engine will max out on the specific processor I'm using. For 4K, turning on DLSS and turning down settings would help to get closer to that seeming limit, but as is, I've got no complaints with how this game runs or looks on the 4080 that I've got. The next game we're testing is Helldivers 2, another DirectX 12 backend title but built on Autodesk's Stingray engine. I tested at the high preset at native resolution and with asynchronous compute turned on, starting at 1080p, and the game returned an average and 1% low of 125 and 96 FPS. 1440p didn't see much of a performance degradation, coming in at 118 and 89 FPS, hinting once again at a potential CPU bottleneck at 1080p. 4K performed well, coming in with an average of 82 and a 1% low of 73. This game is another fun one to play on this card, but once again I'd probably just turn down some settings to gain some performance back at the higher resolutions. I have zero complaints with how it plays, I'm just greedy for my frames. Oblivion Remastered, or what I used to call Memory Leak Simulator, is an enmeshment of the old Gamebryo engine and modern Unreal Engine graphics. Tested at the high preset with medium lumen hardware ray tracing and with TAA, there was another relatively obvious CPU bottleneck at 1080p. With the average and 1% low coming in at 78 and 45 FPS, 1440p was not much lower, coming in at 75 and 43 respectively. 4K remained technically playable, but not where I'd personally want to play, returning 44 and 23 FPS. Oblivion Remastered is another one of those games where you just need to use some form of upscaler. The game also doesn't seem to make proper use of modern many-core CPUs, so the only way to really brute force it is with an AM5X3D chip. The quality of the pixels on display is very high, but it makes me question if this beauty is really worth the high frame times. Red Dead Redemption 2, another Rage title, but this time using the Vulkan API, also performed very well considering the settings we're testing at. Coming in at ultra settings with low grass and water and TAA instead of the other more expensive techniques, and 1080p performed very well, with me once again questioning a CPU bottleneck. 1080p ended up returning an average and 1% low of 164 and 120 FPS, with 1440p making another strong showing of 159 and 108 FPS. Even 4K remained high refresh rate capable, coming in at 118 and 88. Red Dead 2 is definitely not a game that requires DLSS on this card, and it remains one of the best looking and running games of all time. This game is the blast to play on the 4080, and I can't recommend enough trying this game out on any Ada card, because it just runs so well and looks incredible. The last game we'll be testing today is a Unity engine classic built on DirectX 11, Rust, which I'd say I have a love-hate relationship with this game, but there was some characteristic stuttering you'll just run into if you play this game at all. I ran the test at the high preset with full resolution textures and DLAA. My last GPU review with the RTX 3080 had performance issues with the full resolution textures, so I wanted to test using the settings crank to make use of the 16 gigs of VRAM that this card has. 1080p came in with an average and 1% low of 162 and 46 FPS respectively, with 1440p coming in at 144 and 33. 1440p saw the stuttering get worse when compared to 1080p, but to be honest, it didn't seem to get even worse at 4K. The Uber resolution returned an average of 100 and a 1% low of 28, so it remained high refresh rate capable, but did have stuttering at times like I mentioned. Playing this game and not running at 40 FPS is really a treat, but if you want to get into Rust, then a 4060 would suffice, with the 4070 only really coming in when you've got enough scrap to spend on it. In conclusion, I think the RTX 4080 is an uber powerful graphics card that remains a bit too expensive to be a viable option for the majority of users. Building off what I said earlier in this video, I think the 4070 from the same generation is all the graphics card that 75% of users will ever need. It still comes in though at around half the price of the 4080 even used. Focusing back on the 4080, it's easily the most powerful graphics card I've tested on this channel. And while I have concerns about the cost, it's undoubtedly an insanely powerful graphics card that, while not being the absolute top of the line anymore, still delivers enough performance to power through almost all games at 4K and high settings. Would I pick up the 4080 in 2026? Well, only really if you're in the market to spend this much money, because it makes an awesome alternative to the 5080, which sits about $300 more when buying used. Compared to the 5080, you are losing about 10% of the performance while paying about 25% less. It makes sense when you math it out that way, but I think I'm going to be focused on this card the most when it's eventually dropping in price, because it will be an absolutely killer card for literally any and everyone.